We have some pictures of Native Americans on the wall over there, and they were done by a man named Roland Reed. And I've been interested in trying to find out more about his work for a long time. And actually there's a connection between Roland Reed and the day I was born, and I'll later get to that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to read this. Roland Reed's decision came at the last possible moment. By the dawn of the 20th century, this country's Native Americans were living on reservations. Their old ways of life unalterably changed. Royal W., or Roland Reed, Jr., 1864 to 1934, was one of a small number of professional photographers now known as pictorialists who set out to document this vanishing race. Employing new artistic techniques and often posing their subjects, the pictorialists recreated the noble savage as they imagined them to have been in the past, not as they presently found them. Reed's better-known contemporary, Edward Curtis, enjoyed broad backing and financial support for his work. Reed did not. His work was solitary, self-directed, and self-funded. Critics agree that Reed's photographs are equal, both technically and artistically, to those of Curtis, but his work has remained largely unknown and unpublished. Reed lived with and photographed the Ojibwa in Minnesota, the Blackfoot, Piegan, Flathead, Cheyenne, and Blood in northern Montana and southern Canada, and the Navajo and Hopi in Arizona. He had begun work on a publication of his collections with the Reed's Photographic Art Studios of North American Indian at the time of his accidental death. This unfinished work is the genesis for Alone with the Past, which realizes Roland Reed's dream. Why am I interested in this? Roland Reed actually lived here from 1916 through 1919. He was a first cousin of Roy Williams. Roy Williams came here as a land seller for the Rusto and Lumber Company in 1916, or 1913, excuse me. He came up first to sell, or to try to winter horses for a horse market in the Twin Cities, and they were trying to get Rusto on to feed the horses over the winter, and they offered him a job as a land salesman, which he took. Now, Roy Williams, when he was selling land, picked out what he thought was one of the best spots around for himself, and it's on Lake Willapiro, where our cabin is, where Roger's cabin is. And that's solely...
that too.
Yes, and Hamel, it touches, it's right in the middle, so his property touched all three lakes, was on all three lakes. Well, after a while, his father, Williams, came up and visited the place, and he thought it was from the Twin Cities, and he thought it was a great place too. He was a preacher down in the Twin Cities, I don't know what church, and he bought property and moved up here, and he became a teacher in the Drummond school system, and he taught at least 6 years up here. Well, Roland Reed and Roy Williams are first cousins. And Roland Reed came up here and bought property on what is now Pines Point. It used to be Reed's Point, and he built a cabin there in 1916. That cabin is still the central part of Dead Pine's house. It's still there.
Yeah, when they did the big expansion, they just
built
built out
around.
around the original. They didn't tear it down. So they had to rebuild the fireplace, though. But
Yes.
they rebuilt it exactly as it was. It just, it was falling apart.
With modern safety,
Yeah,
whatever you could do.
yeah, they did a lot to try to preserve that feeling.
He spent at least 2 winters here till I drove him crazy, and he said he was talking to himself, and then he decided too much, and he decided to move on. Well, he sold his place to the Little family, who was would have been Deb Pine's great-great-grandmother. And so it's been in the Pine family ever since. Now, I'd like you to think back to about 1916.
Is that when you were born?
No. I'm not to that story yet.
I just had to put that in.
Yes, I know, and I appreciate it. He would have got off the train over here at the depot. At the time, this is 1916, the road that came into town came past the cemeteries and down the dip and up the hill and straight across, turned the corner, came right by here. So he would have got off the train there, and if he'd have walked out there, he'd have walked right along that road. And that road then got back to 63, where 63 is now. But when it got to the hill where the Tri-Lakes, or the Blue Moon Road starts, it turned left. That was the main highway again. It went right past Sarah Baldwin's house. That was the main highway.
It was, yeah.
He would have walked in the Brady Road, which is right across from her house, and they would all go over to, when any member of that family, even if they were like at Reed's, there was no road coming around that side. The Tri-Lakes Road was not completed all the way through. So they would go over to Roy Williams' house, and if somebody was over at Reed's or Pines and they wanted them to come over with a boat and pick them up, they'd go out there and ring a cowbell. And then somebody'd roll over and take whoever was back. So he was here, he lived here, he was in cable. He walked through this town who knows how many times in 2 to 3 years.
Wow.
Going back and forth.
Do we know if he took any photographs?
That's been my question. So, a couple months ago, I called I was looking on, I've looked over the last 10 years on the web occasionally for stuff about Roland Reed. And I was going on the state historical website and couldn't find any mention of him ever living in Wisconsin at all. Not one picture of his is on there. But if you go to the Minnesota historical site, which I hate to say it, but it's a lot easier to navigate around than the Wisconsin one, and you'll type in his name on a search and you'll pop up a whole page on him. He did have studios, though, in Rochester and Bemidji, and we know he took photos of the Ojibwa over there.
They have most of the photos over there.
Well, the family seat continues to live, a lot of them in the Twin Cities, and the cabin, the Roy Williams house is still in the family. I can't think of the name, but there's 2 brothers, I think.
Well, Dahlstrom.
Estes, isn't it?
It used to be. No,
Yeah, it's Dahlstrom.
Dahlstrom.
They're
Direct
direct
descendants
descendants.
of
What
Roland
did
Reed.
Royal say?
Is it
He's
Sarah
fifth
Jane
generation,
Floyd?
and his youngster was there at the Lake
Yeah.
Organization picnic, 6th generation.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the old house is gone.
Williams?
Yeah, wasn't that the one that was right next to the Etsy house, the old green?
Yeah, it may be that old house,
It
old
could
Roy
be.
Williams' old house.
Yes,
I can remember my folks taking me over there because when we'd come up on vacation, they'd go over and visit. And I was really enthralled with that when it got dark and you had to fire up some gas lanterns there. You know, so you had light because there was no electricity out in that area until mid-1950s.